Good evening. Welcome to Glasgow. My name is David Watkin, and it's a pleasure to be here talking to you on behalf of Chamber Music Scotland. Let me just tell you a little bit about CMS, just briefly. It's an amazing institution which really looks after both concert goers, promoters, music clubs, and musicians alike. And it's doing wonderful work bringing together those various interests, including in this rather extraordinary time of lockdown. So I thought it would be interesting to do a little bit of what I think sometimes is rather condescendingly called audience development. I prefer just to think of it as just sharing ideas, talking about some of the things that have inspired me on my journey, particularly on my journey with Bach. I've called this talk Sei Solo after the beginning of the first page of the first page of Bach's violin sonatas and partitas. Let me just check I can do this. I think I might have already messed this up. Let's close that there. Great. So that's me, and I recorded the Bach cello suites some time ago, 8 or 9 years ago now, and that experience for me was something that took me into a world of connecting different parts of my life, if you like. It was a journey that brought, for instance, my participation in Sir John Eliot Gardner's Bach Cantata Pilgrimage in the year 2000. Bringing all of those things together meant that the actual recording of the cello suites for me was able to be something that brought those things together. Sorry, I'm just Richard is very kindly helping me here online. I'm going to just take over again. There we are, that's me. So this is the front page of the violin sonatas and partitas. Very like almost any other book of usually groups of six sonatas or concerti grossi or whatever they are. He writes this thing at the top that looks like 6 solos, but of course his Italian grammar is wrong. It should really say 6 soli, say soli, and that the implication of what he's written is rather nice, which is it also means to an Italian you are alone. And one rather nice theory, I think it's probably not true, is that he might have written these pieces for violin during the 4 weeks he spent locked up in prison at the kind of whim of one of the dukes in Weimar. I think that's probably a little bit unlikely, but it's a nice idea, and I think for us in terms of our kind of separated life now, it's an interesting thought that how we are alone when we play this music. I've said in the introduction to this that it feels like walking alone into the grandest cathedral, that you are alone and yet you're engaging with the music on the deepest level, the music that is really coming from his biggest to his smallest output. So I'm going to try and, like a good rhetorician, I'm going to try and make my talk follow the rhetorical composition process, which you can see there, invention, elaboratio, decoratio, oratio. So it's the idea, the invention of the idea, then its elaboration, which I suppose would correspond to structure, and that's something I'm particularly interested in. Then the preacher would decorate that elaborate structure with expressions, metaphors perhaps, and we'll talk a lot about metaphors, I think, And of course, the musician, it would be recognizable figures. And Bach's music is full of these things. And then, of course, the final process of composition is oration, delivery, performance, whatever we want to call that. And I think this is a really key element for us to understand this music, which is that it's not like modern music where you go to the shop and you buy it, or you download it from the computer and you put it on your music stand and you learn it and you play it. It exists much more on the spectrum between composer, improviser, performer. So all of these people, it was a much more fluid experience. They were more fluid musicians who were involved in all three of those processes, and things that clouded the distinction between those things. Even Beethoven, for instance, was primarily known as an improviser, not as a solo pianist or a composer in the early stage of his career. So I'm going to start with what any good rhetorician would start with, which is an exordium. In other words, I'm going to explain what my talk is going to be about. You know, today's sermon will be about sin, death and suffering, or some subject like that. So my exordium is to talk about three metaphors that I think are really going to be useful. We'll find ourselves coming back to again and again. The idea of perspective, the idea of balance, and the idea of gravity. So those are things that in any performer, I think they're useful tools, they're ways of thinking about how we play some of this music. So my first question is, how does Bach manage to create, to evoke his grandest scale compositions in with just one instrument with four fingers and four strings? And the example that I'm giving you here is of a kind of lattice work, woodwork done just by cutting away everything possible except the minimum of what you need for the thing to still have structure and meaning. And here's a nice bit of a window kind of that shows you that. But also another way of demonstrating it maybe is to just play this video of a musician I was lucky enough to meet once, actually. Here he is singing a very popular song. I think everybody will know the song, and you'll hear the kind of lattice work that he does to present as much melodic information as he can, as much harmonic information as he can, and as much rhythmic information as he can, all on his own.
Blackbird singing in the dead of night. These broken wings and a hint of light. Boy, your life. Waiting for this moment to arrive. Blackbird singing in the dead of night. David's song and I is and a hint to sing. Boy, your life. Waiting for this moment to be made. Play a hackbird line. Play a hackbird line. Into the light of the top land night. Blackbird singing in the dead of night. David's broken wings and a hint of light. Boy, your life. You were only waiting for this moment to arrive. Blackbird singing in the dead of night. David's Sogging like haze and a to see boy your life you but the waiting for this moment to be free play a hacker fly you do the play a hacker fly into the light on the top light you play a hacker fly you do the play a hacker fly into the light on the top light play a hacker fly you do the play a hacker fly into the light into the light into the light into the light you're dark black 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 night 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 night.
Isn't that wonderful? That was Bobby McFerrin singing Blackbird by the Beatles, Lennon and McCartney. He's making, as I say, this kind of lattice work diminution of the textures without changing the structure. It's very much what Bach is doing with his works for cello on its own or violin on its own. So, for instance, the first three chords that we have those three chords come at the beginning of the St. Matthew Passion. They're the Jesus, na nun diese Rede vollendet hatte, sprach zu seinen Jüngern. It's exactly the same chord progression. The same one as the beginning of the John Passion, the three shouts of Lord, Herr, in the chorus, but in the minor, of course. Herr, 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 unser Herr. It's these structures come back just as valid in this microscopic scale as they are in the grand scale. Now, when this sense of evoking a bigger structure around what you're doing, I've also used the word dialogue, and what I mean is that, for instance, when we hear, if you want to apply for a job in a professional orchestra, one of the things you have to do is, of course, play a fantastic solo, but then you have to play excerpts from the orchestral canon, and that involves playing a couple of lines of Richard Strauss, a couple of lines of Mozart, some Beethoven maybe. Now, it's a very weird experience because you're only hearing a little bit of a grand piece. But what I find when I'm listening to that is that I can tell how aware the person playing it is of the whole around what they're playing. So as I'm listening, I'm hearing the flutes and the oboes and the bassoons all playing at the same time as the person is playing the solo part. And hopefully they're playing that in their head too. They've got something similar. They might be thinking of it slightly faster, or maybe their solo flautist takes a little bit more time than mine does. But our two imaginative accompaniments can have a dialogue between them, if you like. So imagine also a string quartet. Goethe talks about the string quartet being a conversation of four equals. I think it's more complex than that. Each player knows all four parts. And then what happens is, of course, they play their own part, but then they have three dialogues between their imagination and between the reality of what each of their three friends plays back to them. So the stage, if you like, is crisscrossed with these kind of transactions and negotiations of 12, I think it adds up to 12 different kind of versions of what's happening, and the total of what comes out of that. This then applies directly to this idea of Bach, that as I'm playing my G major prelude, you can be evoking your evangelist singing the opening recit of the St. Matthew Passion, or you can be thinking of it as a major version of the opening of the St. John Passion. All of that orchestral, choral, theological weight of what the music brings with it, you can bring to your listening, I can bring to my playing, and there can be a dialogue of those two forces during the performance. And I think that's a little bit of magic. So let me just skip forward. So here is Bach's exordium to his first prelude. So he's telling you, I'm just going to play it. He's telling you of various things, but basically he's fixing the key around the note G. Now, if I'm with a singer and I'm saying, and they say, "Give me my note," and I just go, then they might remember that, they might not. If I give it the context of a triad, try and get it in tune, then that helps them. If I can put it in the context of a cadence, though, that helps them really make G major. It then becomes something in their guts rather than just a note. If I can make that cadence take 3 chords, 4, 5 and 1, the same chords that a blues musician would use, most pop songs use those simple 3 chords, either 2, 5 and 1, like this, or 4, 5 and 1, like I've played. Now, what's interesting about that, I'll just show you what this sounds like with Bach's kind of Bobby McFerrin type figuration. I'll tell you what, you can watch me instead of looking at the music. So, what he's doing is centering the music on G, and this is our middle point. Over on the left here is our subdominant, over on the right here is our dominant. Those are the two things that triangulate us, like Eastings and Westings, and having 2 grid points, grid references on a map to find your place. We find that tonality, the tonic, by these 2 reference points. And of course this is the glue of any Western classical tonal music, or even any tonal music, but certainly for Bach it's something that that for him is super important. Now I just want to make a little analogy here, which is with Hogarth. Now a very good friend of mine, Claudio Ronco, Italian cellist, who's also an art historian, told me about this lovely metaphor that comes from the year Bach died, actually, from 1750. He writes this book called Analysis of Beauty. In this painting, which is a self-portrait, you can't see here, in the bottom corner is an artist's palette, and on this artist's palette is a serpentine line, a line of beauty and grace. Now, this, for him, is a vital part of aesthetics, that live things, organic things, have these shapes, that they can be fatter or thinner, but they must have this kind of 2-dimensional shape. In nature, we see it in the shape of a horse's back, in these leaping dolphins, the waves. We see these shapes everywhere. In architecture, just look around. If you're lucky enough to live in a house that has beautiful moulding in it, you'll see in cross section, I'm not sure if you can see my pointing arrow here, you'll see in cross section this serpentine Hogarthian line of grace and beauty. Of course, a violin scroll, even the moulding around your door, which maybe comes from B&Q or Homebase, other places are available. You'll see those same shapes there in cross section. It's a shape that gives not just beauty but structure. It makes it strong. It makes it dynamic. So this, for instance, this Leonardo painting, a sketch rather of a kind of guy playing polo. You'll see the dynamic movement that comes in the use of these lines of grace and beauty. Of course, Leonardo was, drawing before 1750. Hogarth is pointing to how painters use it, how it occurs in nature. The same with this painting here of the ships. You can see it also in Michelangelo's creation, where God is touching Adam's finger. You see exactly that kind of relationship between those two paintings. Now, this metaphor in terms of music, here it is again as a kind of dynamic thing involving this idea of energy in this kind of Heraclitus's bow thing, or the lyre, which contains its own energy. For flight, the shape of wings, all of these dynamic shapes give us meaning, movement, and structure. So here's a little kind of looks like a medical diagram, doesn't it? This is the first 4 bars of Bach that I was just playing you. You can see the G line going along the middle, and then the subdominant line, the C chord in bar 2 beneath it, the D chord above it, above the line, and then coming back to the G. Now, in other words, he said, setting out his stall, my sermon's going to be about, it's going to take you to the subdominant side, it's going to take you to the dominant side, and this is grounding us in G majorness, if you like. And you can see it looks a bit like a Hogarthian line of grace and beauty. Seen on a bigger scale, this is the whole prelude, with just a very, very rough plotting of the simple basic 3-chord harmony. He goes to the relative minor as well, E, but essentially he's only doing the rock and roll 3 chords. And as you can see, the whole right-hand side of that is this enormous dominant pedal, which he does in the C major prelude as well. But the tail has grown out of a structure that essentially takes on what happens in the exordium. So the exordium first 4 bars gives you this 1 4 5 1, and then we get in the main body again, in the middle of your page there, we get again this 1 4 5 1 aspect. So you could say there's a kind of fractal relationship there, that the opening is giving you a microcosm of what's going to happen, like these shells where the animal makes its chamber, each one, because of the relationships and the golden mean, each one is glued onto the next one, making it a sort of crescendo of structure based on the same idea. I don't want to dwell too long on this idea and trying to imply that Bach is a fractalist, but it's something I think is essential to his structure, and the way he lays it out. This is Jackson Pollock. He's renowned for the same idea, that this is the same painting, and as we zoom into it, and then back out again, we see the same idea, that what he's doing has a fractal relationship at each level. So the closer you get, it still looks like the same painting. It's still got the same kind of idea behind it. So the that connection, I think, is a really important one. The idea that he's laying out his wares at the beginning and taking you through it. So first step on our rhetorical journey, inventio, the idea of invention. So my idea for this is that, again, borrowing from art, the shapes that we do, the way that we approach it, can inform how we play. So for instance, your Hogarthian line of grace and beauty can influence how you might play Brandenburg 3. Typically, you'll hear modern orchestras playing da 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 da, and that shape will be equal in a kind of Stravinsky, all the notes are the same. You might find Baroque orchestras playing da 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 da, or So they'll probably get their pencils out and decide how they're going to shape it. This Hogarthian idea gives you a much more kind of smoothed out, like a violin maker who's made the scroll with a chisel and then sanded over those rough edges and found a shape that's a little bit more organic, and it's not it's more natural, if you like. It doesn't have any sharp edges, any particular stresses on bar lines or half bars or tessitura, the highest note. It's a more organic shape. Another really important idea from art that can influence how we think about music is perspective. So in the Florentine Renaissance, they discover this idea that you can create 2 dimensions on a 1-dimensional piece of paper, or rather 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional piece of paper, by having this vanishing point. Now, I think this is an important thing to think about with in terms of how we use these 3 chords that I'm talking about. So here's home. That's my G major home, which is the vanishing point in the middle. Nearest to us on the page, furthest away from the tonic is, or the goal, the telos, is our subdominant. That's our C major chord. Then maybe in the midpoint, in the mid-range, is the dominant 7th. And here's the key point for Bach, I think. The eternity point, Ewigkeit, the vanishing point in the middle, is our tonic. Remember, the opposite of tonic is gin. It's the tonic is the beautiful, refreshing drink that makes us feel calm. So the etymology of these words that musicians use, like dominant, sort of silverback kind of chord, subdominant, dominates from underneath, a bit more passive aggressive maybe, dominating here, and then the sort of tonic idea that we can be calm when we get there because we know we're at home. Like Joseph Campbell and Claude Lévi-Strauss, the idea that myths involve the hero going on a journey, starting off at home being comfortable, Luke Skywalker maybe, then something terrible happens, he's forced to go away on a journey and undergo certain things in certain order with help from certain types of people, and then he comes back, and once he's back home, there he is in his tonic groove, he's happy again, he's fulfilled, but he's fulfilled his destiny. So perspective as a way of framing the shape of making 3-dimensional the music that we play. And here's a little boy who's walked on his own into Chartres Cathedral, experiencing the wonder of this shape and scale and sheer size of this building, and its proportions, of course, drawn with perspective. There's another nice way of thinking about perspective, which is when you get to the B section of many of these dances, but here's a particularly good example. This is the G major courant. So we've started off. We started off in G major, and then he's got to the end of the A section, halfway through the piece, and of course his new home is now D major. That's become our new tonic. And he carries on. He starts off in D major, our new home. Now we've found ourselves in a new key, which is the subdominant of D major. We've gone from D to G. Now, of course, the point is that is home anyway. that's this G major is already the tonic key that we started in. We started here, then we modulated big time with lots of to D major. Then immediately he cancels that leading note to make it C sharp and takes us in a way back to here, but in another way we've never been there before. We're kind of like the astronauts on the Apollo mission who first leave the orbit of the Earth and look back and see where they've come from. So we see this G major chord here. We see it with a new perspective of having moved away and become Spanish. We're now looking back at Britain and saying that's what it's like to be British. Let's talk a little bit about elaboratio. So I'm now, as a rhetorician, I'm now going to elaborate into a structure. I'm going to sort of spin out what I've been talking about. And I'm going to, and of course for Bach, the equivalent in music is planning the structure of what he's writing. We'll come back to that a little bit more when we look about decoration as well. I want to look at two particular ideas, and that's the idea of balance and the idea of simultaneity of music happening at the same time. Clive Morris, if you're watching, the cello's fine, don't worry. So music happening all at the same time, and particularly the idea of the performer's sense of the whole, the sense of the completeness of the piece outside of time, and how really in the same way as in myth, that a myth exists outside of time, rather like a painting. So that's a metaphor of a metaphor. When we look at a painting, even if it's a kind of narrative painting that's telling a story, we can glance at it and kind of take it in, or we can spend 6 years studying it. But the painting doesn't have to sort of rewind and start again. It doesn't exist in the medium of time. It exists independent of that. Lévi-Strauss talks about about how myth exists in the same way, and he says it's like reading an orchestral score. So, in other words, you're going down through layers like this, rather than in a kind of the same way that reading a novel works. So it's the idea that people already know the stories, and they're celebrating their telling, rather than in the way that a stand-up comedian might tell a joke, or that you might read a novel. So the idea of simultaneity is that as a performer you can hold in your head, outside the medium of time, you can hold the whole composition in your head. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One of them is, they're both from geniuses. The first one is Mendelssohn. Now Mendelssohn, when he was young, before he'd written the octet, I think he was 14, he wrote a piece called Trumpet Overture. And it's quite a nice piece. And he'd written several pieces around that time, but as an experiment, what he did was compose the whole piece in his head without writing anything down at all, and then wrote it down, committed it to paper in a very peculiar way. Normally a composer might sketch things in here, make melody here, make sure the bass line, maybe even some figured bass to make sure that the harmony's right, then kind of score it, fill in the details of texture, rather like Bob Ross doing one of his paintings, if you've ever seen that. Wonderful guy teaching you how to paint. The details going in after the main kind of structural elements. And what Mendelssohn decided to do was compose the piece in his head and then get his pen and start with a score with the first flute part. And he wrote the first flute part out from beginning to end, then the second flute part from beginning to end, etc., all the way down and finishing with a double bass from beginning to end. Now that, if you think about it for a minute, that's the equivalent of drawing a painting in the same way that a printer prints it, which is starting at the top and doing one line at a time, or weaving a pattern in a carpet, only using the warp and not the weft, or is it the other way around? I always mix those two things up. But remembering, having in your head that this thread has to go here and not there, to make that whole shape. The other one in the 20th century is George Enescu, who was Menuhin's violin teacher. Now, Enescu, at the drop of a hat, could sing and play at the piano any of Bach's works. Now, you go into any library that has it, it's an absolutely formidable wall of music. It's an enormous body of work. Even given the fact that he repeats a few pieces and borrows from himself sometimes, it's an incredible feat to think of somebody knowing all of that music. He could also do the same with most of Wagner's main operas. And my favourite story is that that one day the young Amadeus Quartet are coaching with him, I think in Dartington, and one of them says, "Can you help us with our Beethoven?" And he says, "Certainly," sits down at the piano, and several hours later he has taken them through every bar of all 16 Beethoven quartets without preparation. He hasn't sort of thought about it and planned it. He hasn't kind of deliberately tried to memorize it. He keeps that music in his head, a little bit like imagining War and Peace existing on a piece of ticker tape that would probably go halfway around the world, or you can wrap it up into pages and then bind that into a book and stick it on your shelf, and it takes up this much room. So it exists in a non-linear form, if you like. Now, I think performers need to have this sense of another lovely example of this is the story of Bach and C.P.E. Bach, his son, sitting together looking at possible fugue subjects. And they're sitting in silence, just looking at sort of 2 bars of melody, and then saying, J.S. Bach has a little chuckle, and C.P. Bach says to his dad, "What's so funny? What's so funny?" And he points at this fugue and says, "Look, you can see how it can be done upside down, back to front, inside out, and in augmentation." And they chuckle to each other. So I love that idea that a fluent musician like Bach or Enescu or Mendelssohn, a fluent musician can hold in their head at the same time this one piece of music, rather like a myth. At the same time, I think balance plays a role in how we do this. So if you think about how myths are told, in Western culture, they're sung to a meter and to a rhyme scheme, and often it's a rhyme scheme that interleaves, that leads you from A, B, A, and then it introduces C, so that and then A afterwards, and it leads you forward so that you can. It's an aide memoire, if you like. So our equivalent in music to those points, you could say, is cadence. And again, it takes us back to these 3 chords. It takes us back to those 3 chords and the way that they punctuate and generate flow in the music. So let's look at balance in this one little bit of this is the G major Allemande. I've only got to page 3 so far, but I'm not going to do the whole book. So he starts in G major and takes us away, takes us back again. So you could say the kind of opening exordium type bit is the first 4 bars of this. Don't worry if you can't read music, because I'll make sure that you get the sense of what I'm talking about. So I'll just play this opening, because the bit I want you to think about is how I play the beginning of the 4th bar. Now that B at the beginning of the fourth bar, it's a lovely cascading idea. It's a cascading figure, if you like. It's paired. It's just a nice descending tonic arpeggio. Obviously, I'm going to want to play the first note louder than the last note because you've already heard when I play the B that my heart is in G. Then he's decorating that with these little sighing, with these little kind of paired sighing. If it was in the minor, we would be calling it tears, right? There they are, the tears. But this, there we are. This B also, as well as being a strong note at the beginning of a pair, of course, because Leopold Mozart says we have to play the first note of the slur longer and stronger, and the last note softer and weaker. So we're kind of pairing it like that, strong, weak. But it's also strong, weak in the descending arpeggio, strong, weak. But go back to this idea I was talking about of perspective, and we've now got a kind of nested hierarchy because the dominant seventh chord, that's the place where Bach would be using the root of his German verb on the dominant, or even the predominant, the chord before that, and then be using the ending on the tonic. So it might be Jesu meine Freude. I know that's not a verb, is it? So this connection here between the different hierarchies interacting on each other, we're having to make a decision that's setting up how we play that B, because it's a weak note in relation to a big note, in relation to a strong note rather. Now, what I'm doing when I'm playing that Allemande is trying to think of all of those cadence points that happen during that Allemande, and I'm trying to balance them in a kind of simultaneous way between each other. I'm trying to plot them, if you like, and weight them one against the other. Now, I'm going to give you a little, I'll keep talking for a minute. So this is another video which shows you, it gives you a kind of metaphor for thinking about that idea of simultaneous balance of cadence points throughout a piece. So this lady is called Miyoko Rigolo, and her husband, Mr. Rigolo, made up this trick, if you like, this kind of balancing act. I think he was a circus performer. So it looks very esoteric and like some kind of mysterious Eastern discipline, but in fact it's a circus trick. But it's a rather lovely one, and a rather lovely metaphor for what I'm talking about, balancing things simultaneously across a piece. So she's balancing the feather. She's using her own balance of her body. Oh, and this is a kind of Britain's Got Talent program as well. It was probably won by somebody miming to a pop song, but I think she's rather good. So she's balancing these palm sticks, which are of progressively bigger and bigger sizes. Notice that the sticks have shape to them. They're not just flat sticks. They're in fact rather shaped rather like the feather. That structure makes them more dynamic. It gives them more kind of possibility, more potential to be used in a kind of structural way. So what I'm thinking of when I'm watching this is that each one of those intersection points between the sticks is a moment of balance. It's a moment where a cadence happens or where a modulation happens. And here she is now, she's lifting it up. She's still keeping all of these elements together. She's still simultaneously aware of each one of these balance points as she's doing it. You can see it's moving. She's letting it move. She's not trying to sort of fight it. I'll shut up and let you watch what happens. So that's pretty wonderful. She hasn't quite finished yet. And this is the key thing, I think, for a performer to think about, is she kind of proves it. She brings us back to this feather. And I think that's, if you like, the key point is that little bee and the relationship that it has as a little arc with all of the other arcs around it and the hierarchies at work around it. That bee, if you like, is the feather. And you could take any other similar note. There'll be 5 or 6 of them in that one piece alone. And you could think of that as a feather. When you pull it, the whole thing falls apart, if you like. Thank you, Mrs. Rigoleau, for that. I want to just give you another idea to think about, which is, again, we've talked about balance. We have to come back to this idea of gravity to think about how harmony works. So the 2 chords, there's the main chord, there's this chord, and then there's this chord, and their relationship to each other is one of gravity. So, for instance, people will say to me, you're a Baroque cellist, you will play your saraband very fast, whereas Yo-Yo Ma will play it very slowly and lyrically and melodically. Now, I would say, actually, I'm trying to play my saraband as slowly as I possibly can, but I'm thinking of these 2 orbiting bodies, the dominant chord and the tonic chord, as having a relationship to each other. So if you imagine that I was holding a pair of magnets here, when I bring them together, they act on each other. If I hold them this far apart, then they're just lumps of metal. They have no gravitational pull on each other, no magnetic pull on each other, to mix my metaphors. Now, I'm looking for that moment of intersection between these two chords, where they're as far apart as they can be and still have this tension between them, this relationship of tension. That will give me the possibility to carry my energy, to carry the narrative telos, the thread, through between these two bodies here. So in the same way, if you think of the journey of a comet through the solar system, it's going to come past the moon and be a little bit twisted by that. It's going to come round the Earth and be influenced by that. Then it's going to go back out to the sun. Maybe it'll go to Neptune and then come back again. It's being slingshot. It's doing this slingshot round each of these things. Now, I think of a piece of music in those terms. Even, for instance, a piece like the G major prelude, which is just 2 pages of semiquavers. Essentially, the musical journey is like a comet going around the various keys, being influenced by it, being pulled in. Another image I like to use is a skate park. Here's a skate park if you haven't seen one recently. I like to imagine throwing a cricket ball into that skate park and seeing what would happen. You know, it would change direction, it would go uphill and lose speed, downhill and gather speed. It would keep going forever, according to Newton, if there was no friction with the ground. But it's still using its energy to take it on a journey. It's going on a kind of narrative journey. So we've talked about this. I'm just going to get a prop from over here. So we've talked about this this idea of the journey of the cricket ball through the skate park, and that, if you like, that's our listener's ear going through the music in linear time, as opposed to Enescu, Bach, or Mendelssohn, who are conceiving of the skate park as an architectural idea, if you like, and all of the possible journeys of all the different cricket balls through it are held there in one possibility, if you like. Now, a piece like the G major prelude exists in a different way, I would say, or the first prelude of the Well-Tempered Clavier, that one. It exists in a different way to a piece like Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Now, you could say Beethoven's Fifth Symphony or Brahms's FAE Sonata, the pieces that take one motif and obsessively repeat it, that in a way they're like a bit of cross stitch, right? So with a bit of cross stitch you have this kind of material in the background. I'll hold it up like this so you can see it better. So you have this material in the background, right? And don't look at the back, actually, that's really appalling. I'm terrible at the back. But the material is the kind of texture of the piece, and these threads that weave their way through this texture that's constantly there are the motif. So you could say this is like Beethoven 5. Now, a piece like Bach's G major prelude actually is much more like a piece of tapestry, where every thread has meaning. Every thread is connected into the structure and the decoration. Those things are absolutely inextricably linked up together. Any one of those structural notes is much harder to find, if you like. It's much harder to analyze in structural terms, because it could be structural or it could be decorative. And that brings us on to our next layer of of rhetorical composition, which is decoration, decoratio. It's the idea that there's a relationship between structure and decoration, or structure versus decoration, if you like. Now, anyone who's ever done any home improvements involving knocking down walls will know what I'm talking about. That they say to the builder, we'd like to knock through here, please, to make this a nice knock-through lounge. And they'll sort of whistle between their teeth, chew their pencil and say, yeah, but that's a load-bearing wall. If you knock that wall down, your house will fall down. Now, this is a really key thing, and particularly for a tricky to analyse piece like the G major prelude, that each one of these semiquavers could be load-bearing or not. It could be a note that Bach could have written differently on a different day. And in fact, very often when he does lift one of his pieces out and re-employ it somewhere else, he doesn't ever just photocopy it, as it were. He tinkers with it, he changes elements of it, he changes particularly the notes that you can change, the kind of decorative notes that are easy to change. So let me give you some little examples of ways of thinking about it. There we are, decoratio. Let's come at it from this very simple piece of Corelli. It's a sonata in G minor for violin from Opus 5. It's, as you can see, it's written on 2 lines of music for each part. It's the opening movement. However, Corelli wanted players to decorate it. He printed this and sold it as elaboratio. He expected the performer to decorate it. And this is an important point that most recently has been made by Nicholas Cook in his book Beyond the Score, which I really recommend to listeners and performers. So the gap, if you like, between elaboratio and decoratio, the gap is there for Corelli, and he expects the performer to do the decoration. Remember that that Bach's critic Adolf Scheiber says Bach, good composer. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. He's a good composer, but he has got one fault, which is that he takes away from the realm of the performer and gives to the composer. In other words, that invention, elaboration, decoration, oration, Bach moves that gap between performer and composer here, whereas for Scheiber and Corelli, it was here that they have the idea and they elaborate it. They sell you music which is fairly simple and structural, and you know, he was called Arcangelo Corelli. It was, his architecture was beautiful, and then you go along and you improvise on it, you decorate it yourself, and then you perform it. And what's nice about that is that binds together the idea of improvising and performing in one thing. Now Bach, his problem was he was making the cut here. He was saying, don't you muck around with my music by decorating it. I want to give you something that's already decorated and you just perform it. I still think it's different from Stravinsky saying, just be a slave and play what I've written, or Toscanini just saying, come scritto, just play what's written. I'm not saying that Bach is a modernist in that sense, of the relationship between composer and performer, but his contemporaries were aware of this idea that he was overtaking the need for the performer to add anything. And here's an example of this G minor sonata. And again, don't worry if you can't read music, because you will see what I mean just from looking at the page. This is Roman, who was I think he might have been a pupil of Corelli, I'm not sure, but he was a mid-18th century violinist of the Italian school. And these are this is the same piece of music. This is how he played that same piece of music. So rather like my son Sandy, who's a jazz trumpet player, he will sometimes write down the improvisations of Miles Davis or whoever he's into, and it might look something like this, or he might record himself playing something and say, "Wow, I was happy with that one, with that version." The original will be Autumn Leaves or something very simple, but what they produce through their improvisation is very complex. And this is really super complex. In fact, you can see even places where he's modulating away and back again during the same flourish. Here on the third line down, for instance, you can see that happening. Now, again, this is a cheap visual gag, if you like, but it makes an important point. And I know a friend of mine, Dorian Bandy, will disagree with this point, but I want to make it nevertheless, that if I put these two things side by side, if I put this Roman's Ed memoir for his improvisations on Corelli Opus 5 in G minor, next to Bach's first page of his violin sonatas in G minor, you can see, even a non-music reader can see how similar they look. That the kind of flashing runs of demi-semiquavers, even in the context of adagio, that they're still like these kind of petits battements that a ballet dancer might do during a kind of lyrical dance. They're not. It's not a flashy piece. It's a piece that, like the Allemande from the D major cello suite, where the fast notes flow in sorrow rather than being celebrating virtuosity, if you like. And what's interesting to do with Bach is to try and fill in the simple version that Roman was working from. Try and fill in the simple version equivalent for Bach, which would probably look a bit like that. It would be, a fairly simple structure written over a couple of lines. Now, in a nutshell, certainly for Italian music, that is the fundamental issue, the distinction, if you like, between structure, elaboration, and decoration. It's very difficult to think about other ways of describing that relationship. Here's one, though, which is, in fact, before we look at that, Menuhin, great Yehudi Menuhin, one of the great violinists of the 20th century. One of his hobbies, if you like, was to play jazz with Stefan Grappelli. Now, of course, Grappelli was one of the other great violinists of the 20th century, and when they came together, there was a lovely atmosphere of mutual respect. But you couldn't hide the fact that there was something about Menuhin's playing which, he looked like his shoes were nailed to the floor standing next to Grappelli. There's something about his playing which doesn't quite ring true. Even when Grappelli has written out for him an ornamentation, he's written out a version like this thing for him to play, it's still not quite, he doesn't have that idiomatic freedom, that looseness of little notes that Grappelli does. I believe it's because of this confusion of structure and decoration. And here's another example of this. This is the Nikolaikirche in Leipzig. It's the one that Bach played in when he, obviously the St. Thomas's was the main church, but Bach did play in the Nikolaikirche. But he wouldn't have known it like this. It was remodeled as a kind of classical building after Bach's lifetime. And the pillars were turned into these incredible neoclassical pillars with great sort of arcanthus flourishes at the top. I've always been very struck by that ceiling. I just think that's the most incredible thing. Outside it, as a monument to the 1989 revolution, they've built an ornament which is, if you like, rather like one of these pillars that's escaped from where it should be. It's become a load-bearing pillar holding up the sky. It has no structural meaning anymore. It's now something which is simply decoration. Of course, it has very profound meaning as a monument to that, because the Nikolaikirche was one of the centres of the revolt against the DDR. But it's rather nice as a metaphor, if you like, for load-bearing structural pillars in a piece of music like the G major prelude. Our danger as performers, like Menuhin playing jazz, our danger is that we give too much emphasis to something which is actually a simple thing. So this is a monument to one of the great Yehudi Menuhin's kind of insignificant notes in jazz that gets too much bow stress. Here's another example. These are the scissor arches of Wells Cathedral, where I went to school, at Wells Cathedral School. Now, there are actually 12 of them. There are 4 on each level, and then there's the sort of inverted one, and then there's the top one as well. So it's 3 times 4. It makes a kind of box shape. And of course, as you'll know, if you've moved house, and again, so I've recently moved house, moved all of our possessions in paper. And what I mean is cardboard boxes. Now, think about a cardboard box. It has structure because of the wave of the corrugation. Corrugated cardboard is 2 layers like this, 1 layer that's Hogarthian lines of grace and beauty repeated over and over and over again, stuck together, glued to keep them firm. That suddenly becomes something which is much stiffer than this kind of wobbly paper, right? Then you get that and you make it into a box, and then you stick that on there, and then you can imagine moving all of your possessions with that cardboard box. So there's a double layer of structure there of the material itself, and then the shape that it becomes. So these scissor arches in Wells, the first time I saw them, I thought, this is an incredible building. It's a shame they've done this kind of postmodern kind of upside down arch there. And then I discovered they were 14th century, which is just mind-boggling, really, to think of 14th century architect conceiving that and putting it up. And what I want to compare this with is something I walked past many days in Glasgow here, which is Siwoo restaurant and Chinese supermarket. Now, here's another arch. This one here, this arch here, it's a Norman arch, so it has this point at the top, but essentially it's doing the same structural thing. It's load bearing, carrying the load from the center point at the top down. It's channeling the energy, the weight of the tower. It was the reason they had to build it like this was because it was sinking into the soft ground. Now, here's another arch, also, beautiful, perfect shape, but in fact it's just kind of stuck on the front of a warehouse. It has absolutely no load-bearing structural meaning whatsoever. I mean, it has its own structure, but it's not bearing any weight of anything. It's just simply there to look nice. And I think, again, this is one of the dangers that we face as musicians. Do we make something structural decorative, or something decorative structural? That carries us on to oratio, and this is really one of the most difficult things to talk about. Remember, Frank Zappa says something like, talking about music is like dancing about architecture. Well, I don't agree with him, and I think many musicians wouldn't agree. And certainly lots of dancers or choreographers would disagree, and maybe even architects would disagree. I think musicians need a vocabulary to talk to each other about how their music works and what it means, and how they can arrive at a shared interpretation together. I think that level of understanding, even of the simple 3 chords that rock and roll musicians use, that level of understanding and discourse in vocabulary, I think, is such an important element of what we do. But nevertheless, I'm going to try and talk about performance of music and oration. And remember, it's the last stage of a process that began already with the idea at the beginning. The performance is not just a stylistic element that you can kind of choose a different style, like sprinkling on some curry powder after you've fried up your mince. It's something where the curry flavours and all the different herbs and spices are in there from the beginning, that have made it an organic, proper curry, not a kind of chucking a jar of sauce in at the last minute curry. So here we are as performers, we're going back to that very moment of inception of the piece, and we're trying to connect it with how we think about it and how we perform it. And I think an important thing that divides musicians in that debate, if you like, musicians all over the world, is Stravinsky's dictum that the performer should be the slave of the composer, which I mentioned earlier. Now I think pre-modern, as in pre-1920 performers, were much freer in terms of how they interpreted the music that was there, even when the composer hadn't written anything. And I think you can see even in Bach a very good example of this, which is when Schoenberg writes Verklärte Nacht the first time. He's living in Vienna, he's working with musicians, a sextet of musicians who would have worked with Brahms. They were completely part of this tradition of Beethoven, Schubert, Brahms, that tradition of tonal music. The idea of atonality, and incidentally perspective, of course, at the same time as Schoenberg, as Schoenberg freeing music from tonality, painters are freeing painting from perspective. So perspective again becomes a thing that goes in parallel, if you like, with music history. I mean, we were a bit later than the Florentine Renaissance maybe, but tonality and perspective go together in kind of long distance historical terms, very, very broadly speaking. Sorry, where was I? The idea that Schoenberg is writing for Verklärte Nacht. At the very beginning, he wants a special effect, so he writes immer leiser, always be soft. Now, that's because he knew that the players that he had would play da 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 di di dum, da 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 da. He knew they would want to shape it, probably not thinking about Hogarth, but they would be thinking dynamically. And this is an important word that musicians use in two different ways, but tend to use it in the first way, which is a dynamic is like that curry powder that you sprinkle on afterwards. It's a associated board. You've done your notes right. Sorry, nothing against associated board at all. But what I mean is a sort of young level of very basic development, that you've learned the notes, you've got them in the right order, you're making a nice sound. Now you should add the dynamics, sprinkling them on at the end. Now, the way to use the word dynamic, I think, is as an adjective, the opposite of which is static. So Schoenberg, in the beginning of Verklärte Nacht, is basically writing film music. He's got, like Debussy and Pelléas, the trees, the forest, have a character of their own, but they are a static character. The trees of the forest are simply standing there, and the two lovers are walking through that static, and those characters, they have plenty of angst and dynamic energy in their singing, if you like, but the trees themselves are impassive. Now, in order to convey that idea, Schoenberg had to write to those dynamic late 19th century Viennese musicians, immer leiser, don't crescendo, don't phrase. When he comes back and rewrites it in the 20s in Hollywood, and then again I think in 41, he's writing for different musicians. He's writing for musicians who've worked with Stravinsky, who are not part anymore of that 19th century and before tradition of surfing the waves of the music, expressing the dynamic element of the music, of inflecting the music. Schoenberg is writing for musicians who are more like film score interpreters, that they're going to do the film score anyway unless you ask them to do those things. So that's a key division, I think, between musicians. And remember, another example of what I'm talking about comes from Berlioz in the Roi de Tulle, the King of Thule, in the first version of the scenes from Faust. Margarita's song about the King of Thule, which is a kind of ancient, it's kind of an ancient mythical song, like a romance, and he asks her to sing it. And Berlioz writes a paragraph in the score, which is very unusual, describing how he wants it to be sung. He says, don't sing it in the normal way. Don't sing it with the kind of, paraphrasing again here, don't sing it with the kind of phrasing, the little crescendos and falls, carrying the tension through the music. Just sing it completely deadpan. Just sing it as if you're kind of like mourning, you're in kind of shock, and you're sort of mourning something long lost. So Berlioz and Schoenberg both found it important to stress this idea of sempre pianissimo. It's also something that you see in Bach, funnily enough, in the places where he threads a big chorale in augmentation through, for instance, the chorus at the beginning of Part 2 of the St. Matthew Passion, that chorale, or Mein teuer Heiland, that the chorale will be marked sempre piano or sempre pianissimo, because he doesn't want the singers to phrase up too much. He wants that to be a little bit more in the background. Excuse me. So one of the other things that, so two more little points. One of the things that I've said about these suites is the idea that they're not for soloists. Now, I realise it's very contentious. What I mean is, of course, they're for everybody. The music is universal. There is no sort of ownership. We don't have to be a card-carrying Lutheran Christian from Thuringia to enjoy Bach. It belongs to everybody. But what I meant was that the six cello suites don't exist on a continuum which goes Bach cello suites, Haydn concertos, Beethoven sonatas, triple concerto, getting more loud and soloistic and difficult. Where was I? Beethoven, Brahms, Schumann, Shostakovich. We learn our instruments as musicians through the medium of solo repertoire, which is fine, I think, if you're a violinist. If you're learning a Mozart violin concerto and then you're sitting in a pit playing the first violin part of a Mozart opera, that will stand you in good stead, I guess. Maybe not so much for the second violin part, certainly not for the viola part, definitely not for the cello part or for the double bass part. But the double bass and the cello and the viola, they still have to learn their instruments. And what do they use? They use soloistic repertoire. They learn the concertos, the flashy solo pieces. Now, historians, musicians, we're a very long way behind other disciplines. Historians used to call that Whig history, W-H-I-G, which meant the history of great men. It was the history of politicians, prime ministers, kings and queens, and their actions, and the political shenanigans that went on. It was the history of those dynasties, if you like. More recently, in the 60s, historians like E.P. Thompson have been thinking much more about what he calls history from below, the idea that in those events in the late 18th and early 19th century in England, that there were social and political events taking place because of the Industrial Revolution, let's find out what was going on in the labour movement then. Let's find out what life was like for an ordinary weaver in Derbyshire, and how was their political consciousness, how was that affecting the bigger political picture. So history from below translates here, rather than thinking about a book like The Great Cellists by Margaret Campbell, which is a typical Whig book, if you like. Each chapter takes us through the history of the cello, and it finishes, and I'm paraphrasing again, this cellist helped us push forward the bounds of technique. So in other words, it's the assumption of progress. And this is the key meta-narrative, the big story here, helped us accept the cello as a solo instrument, and liberated it from the bass line. Now, of course, those are interesting stories, and it's an interesting idea that, for instance, the double bass, that pieces like Kusevitsky bass concerto, that they've liberated that bass player from sitting at the back of an orchestra playing, boom, 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 boom. Suddenly he's up here playing gorgeous melodies and really complex figuration in those pieces. Just as in the Dvorak cello concerto, it's kind of amazing to behold when you think about it, when really the cello's job is playing the bass line. We are a bass instrument. But the problem of focusing only on that story, and the problem for young musicians now, I think, having focused on that element of their instrument, the solo playing, is that the whole bulk of the rest of the job of being a cellist is neglected. So the question of how, for instance, you play the cello part in an early Mozart string quartet tends to be neglected. So for me, I'm interested in this history from below, literally from below the bass clef, thinking about the music, and how that connects with these pieces, these 6 pieces for solo cello by Bach. What I would say is that the preparation for playing those 6 suites doesn't come from backwards playing Shostakovich concertos, Dvorak, Schumann, Haydn, Bach. It's not something down a telescope. And remember, in Margaret Campbell's book, the implication of each chapter, that person pushing forward the bounds of the technique, when you look down that telescope, the poor little guy who's playing the Bach cello suites for the first time has obviously a very, very modest technique. Now, I think you need more technique than that to play these pieces, and you need different techniques. You need the kind of techniques that Anna Belsma would do, which involve all kinds of clever ways of using the hand to sustain notes that when you show them to a solo cellist, they're kind of surprised at. So when I say not for soloists, what I mean is the preparation is from being part of this narrative unit, and the narrative unit is evangelist, organ, cello. And that's the recitative for the St. John or St. Matthew Passion, sitting there holding that story as part of that. When you play one note, cadence, new note. That dramatic energy that you're holding, like these planets who are in gravitational pull in relation to each other, that connection through the silence that supports the line of the evangelist. That's the job. And plotting those notes, even though you might only have 4 or 5 notes on a whole page of music, and the evangelist has got words and words and words, loads of words, we've got 4 notes. Our job is still to connect them, to connect the meaning, the sense, literally the sense of the text through the harmonic connection. And I think that's the best possible preparation for playing these suites. I want to give one more little thought, which is again coming back to this idea of the relationship between the text, the written text that we have, and what it means to us as a performer. And just bring in a thought from Robert Bringhurst, who's a poet and a translator of Native American oral mythology. And he writes about oral literature, which of course is an oxymoron. Literature means something written down, so you can't have written down oral literature, if you like. But he's involved in this process of freezing in time the telling of a story by Native American myth tellers. So they're people who've inherited these myths. They've been told them by their parents and grandparents over, the same timeline that we would have had for our Western myth tradition from Greece that was written down at an earlier point. These have only been written down since the mid-19th century, and are still being written down now. And the point that Bringhurst makes is that this is an oral tradition that books can't contain. Something like jazz or Indian classical music, where a score can't contain it. Now, what I'm saying about Bach is that Bach is like jazz as well. It's something that a score can't contain it. It's this continuum between improviser, performer, composer, where all of those things are being held together. Now, he also says that a lovely idea, I think, which is that reading comes before writing in man's history, going back millions of years, hundreds of thousands of years. That reading comes first because we read animal tracks, we read other people's reactions, we read nature, we read the waves or the weather, and writing only comes along in terms of leaving tracks or leaving behind a trace on the world. So reading is an older idea. Now, in this oral myth-telling tradition, you can read a performance, but you can't read a text of it. Now that changes a little bit how you think about the relationship between me playing my Bach suite and me playing a piece of music that's just been written by a living composer who's giving me instructions about exactly what they want, or me playing a piece of Stravinsky where he said just do what's on the page, reproduce it. Remember, Schoenberg and Adorno were talking about the idea that one day we'll be able to get rid of performers altogether. Wouldn't that be great? Because we wouldn't have these unreliable, almost like a sort of Lutheran Reformation, that we wouldn't have a priest coming between us and God, if you like. We could go straight to the listener. Now, I think the role of the performer here is really different and really important in the sense that a Native American myth teller gives something to the story. He brings, or she brings, some of their own experience and life to the story as it evolves. And one of the points he makes is oral literature looks like writing, but that's not what it is. And I would say, I think that's probably the best description I could give for any page from Bach's violin or solo pieces. It looks like written music that you might buy in a shop, but it's not what it is. It exists on another level. And then Bringhurst says about this, if these Native American myth tellers, if they are to speak, we must find a way to listen. And I think, again, that's a nice parallel with what we do as listeners when we hear this music, our dialogue, how much we bring to the listening and what we're prepared to engage with as we do it. Thank you very much. I think I'm going to just go here to this slide here. I've really enjoyed meeting you all and having this little talk. There's an opportunity, if anyone wants to ask questions. I'm getting them here, and I'm going to look and see what questions are there. But you can send them in. So here is a question from Andy McGregor. And Andy says, we often celebrate late Beethoven and Brahms and nearly middle-aged Schubert. Do you sense a refinement or strengthening of Bach's architecture towards his later work? I think that's a great question. I mean, Schubert, nearly middle-aged Schubert, we talk about Schubert knowing that he was going to die in the C major quintet. In fact, he just spent £50 on having lessons in counterpoint with Simon Schuster, I think it was, and he'd only had 2 or 3 lessons. You know, he was engaging on all kinds of projects. He had absolutely no intention of dying, or knowledge, I think, that he was likely to die. So we can't talk about his late period. There is an obsession with late Beethoven, which I think, I think Adorno has a lot to do with, because he was writing about late Beethoven and lateness, the idea of late style, and Edward Said has written about it as well. And of course, the thing about Brahms is that he gets a kind of Indian summer towards the end of his life when suddenly he just gets a fresh burst of energy and starts having given up, basically. I think with Bach, there's an incredible sense of workmanship and good, honest, getting on with it and making music to the best of his ability. Do you remember he says, in response to a question, I think, he says, anyone with the grace of God and hard work, anyone can achieve what I've achieved, towards the end of his life. And I find that very, very humbling. Of course, when he got to Leipzig, remember he was, for the first 3 years, he was producing cantata every week, which is an incredible output of energy, of not just producing, but rehearsing, copying, and then, I was going to say performing, but orating them in the context of the service. And it reminds me of the idea that David Rubio, the late violin and cello maker and harpsichord maker, has about Stradivarius making violins, which was which was the idea of flow that Mihai Csikszentmihalyi writes about. In fact, just Google flow, because it's impossible to spell his name. And it's the idea that if you're in the zone, if your work flows, then you don't stop to think about time. Again, it's a kind of non-linear, it's a non-incremental way of building a violin. And the word that David Rubio used for Stradivarius was, just because of the sheer number of instruments he made with daylight and candlelight and no electricity, that it's like throwing a pot, where you sort of throw down your lump of clay on the turntable, and you pedal away, you make the pot like this, and then it's finished. You're not gradually thinking left a bit, right a bit, oh no, up a bit, down a bit. You're not engaged like a good golf swing. You can't be correcting it during the course of the swing. It's a single gesture, like really good calligraphy. I think, for me, I think that's what Bach, that's what fascinates me about Bach, that he keeps doing that. He's in that flow, turning out that huge amount of music. Certainly when you look at his very early works, you can see some clunky bits there. By the time he gets to 1720 and he's writing these pieces, I don't see clunky bits, and then it's kind of home in from there. Here's another question. It's from Pedro de Alcantara. Hi, Pedro. Can you say something about the archetype of dance manifested in Bach's suite movements, assuming that the notion of archetype of dance exists? That's a great question, Pedro. And I think, actually, I'm just going to, because one of the things I was going to talk about, if there was time, was meter. And I was going to name check you, Pedro. Here's a bridge, which shows you a nice thing of kind of connected sort of dynamic energy in a structure. And here's Pedro's book, Indirect Procedures. Now, Pedro is the person that first introduced me to the idea of meter in music and poesy, prosody, that everything that we do has a sense of weak, strong, like an iamb, or strong, weak, like a trochee, or it can be an amphibrach that goes weak, strong, weak, like banana. And I think once you start thinking like that in Western classical music, you're onto a winner. It gives you straight away a focus that you can take from how loud am I playing, what's my technique doing. If you're thinking then about the music and how it works, so the relationship between poetic meter and harmony, for instance, Jesu meine Freude, in that Bach chorale, you will get the strong words lining up with the predominant chord, and then you'll get the dominant chord, and then on the tonic resolution you'll get the little bit, singen, the bit of the word that German speakers don't even open their mouths for, they just kind of hum it, right? Now, that, I think that relates really nicely to dance, because of course dance equals rhythm plus harmony. And it's that sense of, it's not just rhythm, it can't exist on its own as rhythm, I think. But in terms of harmony, if we can make those inflections swing, then it's going to have dance. And one question that's maybe related to Pedro's question is whether anybody did dance, a courant and a gigue. They didn't dance Allemands because none survived from Bach's day. They were kind of already dead, if you like. But all of the other dances, choreographies existed from Bach's lifetime. Now, I don't think that means, though, that they had a cellist sitting in the corner playing bum 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 and 8 couples danced a courant up and down the room. But in the same sense, if you go to Ronnie Scott's in London and listen to Latin jazz, nobody's dancing. The tables are nailed to the floor. You'll be thrown out if you get up and start dancing. But the music dances. It still feels like salsa. It feels like rumba. It's still got those dance rhythms and that inflection that creates it. And I think your question was about archetypes of dance. I think certainly, for me, archetype sets up a big question about the hero's journey, which I think is another book that you told me about, Pedro. Thank you. And it's the idea that archetypical things, that we can recognize them in music. Robert Jerdingen has written about musical archetypes that find their way into composition from all kinds of areas and things that you might find in Mozart or Bach or anywhere in between that, particular cadential phrases or chord progressions. And I think it's clear that those habits of composition, if you like, were present, whether it was conscious or not. I think dance types, I would say, definitely I would say go and look at this book by Little and Jen, which is called Dance and the Music of Bach. The point they make very clearly is that Bach only wrote a couple of hundred movements with dance titles, but dance, French Baroque dance, pervades huge swathes of his music, church music. So I think those dance archetypes find their way into Alleluia kind of text settings, resurrection settings. You'll hear these kind of 3/8 fast minuets, all kinds of things that his contemporaries would definitely have recognised. I hope that answers your question, Pedro. Here's another question from, I hope I'm saying this right, Blai Bossa Toca. How did you choose the bowings for the suite and other resources we can use apart from Anna Magdalena, Kellner, etc.? Now, I think just coming to Kellner for a start his purpose for writing out the cello suites and the violin sonatas and partitas was because he wanted to arrange them for harpsichord. I don't think any exist. I don't think any survive of those arrangements. But his purpose was to have a copy of it so that he could use it in that way. So for him, the slurs were less important. And I'm glad you asked this question because I find it very interesting. When Bach wrote his music, John Butt has done much work on this in his book, Bach Articulation Marks. But pointing back to the 1950s, this isn't John writing in the 1950s, but the Bach Gesellschaft writing in the 50s, saying that the way Bach notated, he would do 4 blobs, 4 tails, make them semiquavers, and then give them a slur. Then move on to the next 4 blobs, tails, semiquaver, slur. Now, and they know that because the ink, as you dip your quill in the ink and you start writing, the ink is very dark. The pen is loaded with ink and it writes really clearly. Gradually it gets weaker and weaker as you do this blob, 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 tail, semiquaver, slur. Gradually it gets weaker until you have to dip it back again. But you don't want to do it too soon because there's a kind of economy of effort there, right? So once it starts to get too light, then you have to give up, go back and dip it, and then it becomes black. Now that means that we can see the order of how, I say we, these scholars back in the 1950s in Leipzig, they can see where the slurs match the ink type of the notes and vice versa. And with Bach, as I understand it, and certainly Anna Magdalena as well, you can see that the ink thickness is the same as the slurs all the time. So they gradually get lighter together and then they suddenly both gradually get heavier again. With Peter Kellner, it's the opposite. You can see that he's written out the music, if you like, and then he's put the slurs in, which is a much more modern, more 19th century way of writing, if you like. The idea that you write the music and then you add the slurs, like sprinkling on the curry powder. For Bach, the slurs were the spices at the beginning of the process of making the curry. They were an integral part of the music that delineated something important about it, which was to do with these figures of decoration. So I would say that I don't know any source better than Anna Magdalena's. What I would recommend is looking at Anna Magdalena's copy of the violin sonatas and partitas and looking at those. So then you've got a kind of quadratic equation that goes Anna Magdalena Bach, Anna Magdalena X, which is working out what Bach's own autograph would have looked like. We can see from Bach's habits in the way that he writes, for instance, John Butt points out the first page of the St. John Passion, that this figure of 4 slurs in the violin part looks like da doo da doo da doo. It looks like that because the slur comes under the line. But then lower down the viola part gets it and the slur's above the line, and suddenly it looks like da ba da ba. So this is a habit that Bach had, that his slurs under the line tended to start a bit late and his slurs above the line tend to finish a bit too early. Now we know that he meant that to be a 4 rather than 2 different things, and this is where I part company with my wonderful mentor Anna Bilsma, because Anna would say vive la différence, let's do it like it looks, even though it doesn't make sense. I think we need to bring more thought, if you like, to that communication from the composer, and assume that they're saying, you know what I mean. I don't have to write all the way to the end of the slur. I can just go whoosh, with a fluent gesture, a flowing gesture, which I don't need to control in a very literal way because you'll recognize it. And the best example is in the G major courant, where where you have this figure. Now that's a figure called a mesanza. You have three notes which are conjunct and one note that sticks out on its own. And the bowing that Anna Magdalena is expressing, especially here, when it comes back at the end, the bowing that she's indicating is 3+1, which makes sense because it goes with this rhetorical figure mesanza. However, what she's left us is a kind of dog's dinner, where it looks a bit like it looks like something random and bizarre. Anna has said in his fencing master book, "Vive la différence." Let's do that. He proudly said, "I've now learnt all of Anna Magdalena's bowings," and I didn't really realise what he meant till I heard it. He'd actually learnt to do all of these, I think, not important bowings. It's the mistake of identifying too strongly with differences, I would say, and that's one of the key aspects of structuralism as a kind of discipline, is looking for what the differences are. How do we sort of find the lowest common denominator of patterns, if you like, what things belong as patterns and what things aren't as patterns. So if you think of leaves on a tree, all of the leaves on an oak tree will be oak leaves, and they will all have that particular pattern. Some of them will be slightly bigger or smaller, some of them will be fat green leaves, some will be shriveled brown leaves. The things they have that are different don't matter. The point is they're all oak leaves. So I think I would just say stick to Anna Magdalena as the closest source, and the idea that it just needs contextual interpretation to find what she's hinting at. Here's a question from Raj Baumik. When Mahler wrote his many instructions to the player, were they meant more to counter or to enrich the player's instincts? That's a great question, Raj. I think it's interesting because Mahler was working with a particular group of musicians, and he was on the edge. He was on the cusp of that modernist time when that results eventually in Stravinsky saying, "Look, just play what I've written. Stop mucking around doing phrasing crescendos and stuff like that." He's kind of super controlling. I mean, maybe Mahler was an obsessive, controlling personality. I don't know. We have to remember that these people exist on a kind of grand historical narrative, perhaps, but actually they're all individuals and their own specific wishes for how their music sounded. Even today, if you talk to composers today, some of them will say, "Oh, I don't care if you want to change that. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, that's good too. Change it." And others will say, "No, absolutely not. I've written exactly what I mean. Please just play it." You've used an interesting word, Raj, which is instinct. And it's a tricky one. I always try and avoid it because instincts are what animals have, and intuition is what angels have, and we're kind of somewhere in between, most of us. I like to think of head, heart, gut, feet. That how we think about something can, every musician works as a result of the interplay between those things. And our heart, whatever that is, and our gut, whatever that is, the way that that we can inform those feelings that we have about the music. And don't forget your feet, which my wonderful colleague Alice McGillivray taught me about. That she would say, we'd be talking about a dance in a Bach movement, and she'd say, "I'll ask my feet," and stand up and do a little dance. And her feet would tell her, "Yeah, no, it's slightly too slow." Yeah. So it's the way it feels in the body, and I don't think we should be ashamed of that feeling that we have. But on the other hand, instinct maybe isn't the right word for it. Here's a question from Eugenio Solinas. Do you think there is an arc above the cello suites, a sort of umbrella or big slur that links all the suites? Or maybe one of those shape of beauty lines, like the ones you showed in the beginning of your talk? I do, Eugenio. I think for me, when we looked at the B in bar 4 of the G major Allemande, for me it's about zooming in to that one note and seeing its relationship between its neighbour, and then zooming out a little bit and seeing how it fits into that cadence, and then zooming out, seeing how it fits into that 4-bar exordium, then zooming out, see how does it fit into the whole first section, how does it fit into the whole Allemande, how does it fit into that suite, how does it fit into the book, and then how does it fit on the wall in the library of Bach's music, and then where does that sit in relation to Western art music, and then where does that sit in relation to human endeavour, if you like. So, and maybe you could go on, I'm not sure, but I think absolutely I feel this arc through the 6 suites. I think it's not necessary to play them in one after the other to have that. Messiaen in the Quartet for the End of Time gives you these, in the first movement, each player has a little arc of a grand circle where their rhythm and their pitches only combine if they play it 1,000 times. And another one has another rhythm and another pitch set, and they only come back to bar 1 if they play it 2,400 times. And for all 4 players to come back to bar 1, it would be several years of playing it non-stop to arrive there, and that's how he gets at this idea of the end of time. But an arc as a tiny segment of a circle, of a whole, I think is a really important idea for us to have as performers. It's a lovely question, thank you. And really the subtitle for this talk was going to be the performer's sense of the whole, and that sense of the whole circle around everything that we do and how everything intersects and connects. Here's a question from Molly McWhirter. Hi Molly. Do you have any special tips for memorising Bach? I had a tip from Anna Belsma, which was start at the beginning. Well, first of all, learn the piece, embody the piece, get to know it, analyse it, work through it, make it part of your being, and then if you're thinking about then if your memory in a performance has problems, what he would do is start at the beginning and then keep going until he made a mistake, fix it, in other words, stop and work out what was going wrong. And if you think about it, the things that can go wrong are the fingers are fine, you've remembered the kind of muscle memory pattern, but you're maybe on the wrong string, and that's something I'm sure cellists are nodding around the world saying, yes, I've been playing it on the wrong string, the right notes but on the wrong string. Or you can remember the music but you can't remember which finger to put down to play that note or that series of notes, in which case learn to improvise, learn to play by ear. And again, this is a thing that I owe to Pedro de Alcantara, who I hope is still listening, which is that he's the first person that sat me down and said, improvise. And so I gave it a go, and of course it was absolutely awful. I realised that on that day that I couldn't really play by ear. I couldn't play the notes that I heard in my head. So I had, creative making up music going on in my head, but I didn't know what to do. And I noticed then, if you ask even really wonderful musicians, even people sometimes come to me for a lesson who are super advanced kind of postdoctoral level cellists, and sometimes I feel there's something lacking, there's a connection lacking in their playing. So I asked them to play Happy Birthday, and sometimes people will come from playing Dvorak or Bach 6, incredibly well, but they can't play Happy Birthday. Da, 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 Now, I taught myself, having realised that was me, I can't play Happy Birthday, within a few weeks I'd learnt how to play fluidly, just by doing it every day, just by picking a tune, playing it, try another key, play it, work out the bass line, play it, work out a kind of what my kids used to call widdly diddly, which is the kind of just a kind of rambly, rolly, kind of guitar pattern left hand, kind of Bachy Duport type barrelage right hand. With that you can kind of intersect harmony and rhythm on any kind of accompaniment. And I think once you're thinking like that, that will serve your memorizing Bach issue. Then his next thing was, he said, if you get stuck, you fix it. You work out why you went wrong. Did I put the wrong finger down? Can I hear it but not remember the fingers? So it's the different ways in. There's the musical memory, the muscle memory, the kind of kinesthetic memory. Fix it, and then go back to the beginning. And that was the key point, that you always go back to the beginning. You can cheat a little bit and go back to the beginning of the second half if you go wrong in the very last bar, but always go back to the kind of reset, reboot point, if you like, and go back there. And then you'll just, if I was playing one of the suites, I would just remind myself the way this sequence here works. And one of the things I used to do was use the Bach suites to practice by ear, working out sequences, working through the keys. But the problem with that is that you can become too fluent, if you like, and end up going round one cycle of fifths too many in your Bach suite, and then ending up in F minor instead of C minor, which would be not very good. Thank you for that question, Molly. Let me just see if there's any more questions. No, I don't think so. Wonderful. Thank you very much, everybody. And we've done all of the questions. It's been a great pleasure talking to you all. Thank you for having me in your homes. And I hope you've enjoyed being in Glasgow on this lovely Wednesday evening. I'd like to thank Paul Tracy at Chamber Music Scotland and his wonderful team. Hayley Barclay, and particularly Richard Clifford, who's been helping me. Is he still there? Give my mouse a wave, Richard, if you're still there. He's magically working my computer by remote control, which is kind of like spooky watching it. But he's done a great job, thank you, and also editing those videos together. And also, can I just draw your attention again to the Chamber Music Scotland's work. They do a really wonderful job promoting chamber music and new collaborations all around Scotland, and they really do fantastic work. So thank you very much.